Pay rent or get out. Those words hit me harder than the truck that put me in this hospital bed. My father stood there, his face red with rage, while my stitches were still fresh, the pain medication barely touching the throbbing in my ribs. When I said no, he slapped me so hard I hit the floor, tasting blood in my mouth, feeling something crack in my chest. "You think you're too good for this family?" he sneered, but he had no idea what was coming. I'm Quiana Graves, 29 years old, and this is the story of how my own father tried to destroy me when I was at my lowest, and how I turned his greed into his greatest downfall. Before I continue, if you're listening to this, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your support means everything to me, truly. The accident happened 3 days earlier. A drunk driver ran a red light and T-boned my car on the driver's side. I was lucky to be alive, the doctors said. 3 broken ribs, a concussion, 27 stitches across my forehead, and enough bruising to look like I'd gone 10 rounds with Mike Tyson. The other driver's insurance was fighting coverage, claiming I was partially at fault, which was complete nonsense since I was stopped at the light when he hit me. But here's what you need to understand about my father. Donald Graves never saw me as his daughter. He saw me as a cash machine. Ever since my mother died when I was 14, I'd been paying my way. First, it was small things. Lunch money from my babysitting jobs. By 18, I was covering my own college expenses while living at home. By 25, I was paying 80% of the household bills, while he spent his money on his new wife, Barbara, and whatever get-rich-quick scheme caught his attention that month. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and despair. The nurse who witnessed him hit me suddenly found something very important to do at the other end of the ward. That's the thing about my father. He had this way of making people look away. 6'3", built like a linebacker gone to seed, with hands that had worked construction for 30 years before his convenient back injury got him on disability. Funny how that back never hurt when he was playing golf every Tuesday. Barbara stood behind him, clutching her fake Louis Vuitton purse, the one she bought with the credit card she'd opened in my name. I didn't know about that yet, but I'd find out soon enough. She had this nervous laugh, like a chihuahua with anxiety, and she kept doing it now. These little yips of approval every time my father raised his voice. My brother Jake was there too, leaning against the doorframe, scrolling through his phone. 26 years old and still living in his childhood bedroom, still letting Daddy pay for everything while owing me $5,000 from when his brilliant cryptocurrency investment went belly up. He'd promised to pay me back in monthly installments. That was 14 months ago. My father's new girlfriend, Tiffany, waited in the hallway. 22 years old, fresh out of beauty school, with extensions that cost more than my monthly car payment. She kept popping her gum and checking her reflection in her phone screen, completely oblivious to the family drama unfolding. Or maybe she just didn't care. When you're sleeping with a man older than your own father, I guess you learn to ignore a lot. Here's the thing, though. While my father was standing there, screaming about the rent for the room I'd been paying for since I was 18, he didn't know about my side project. He didn't know about the late nights I'd spent building something of my own, the careful planning, the calculated risks. He thought I was just his pathetic daughter, working as a marketing coordinator at a mid-size firm, barely making ends meet. My boss had already called twice, warning me that if I missed any more work, they'd have to let me go. Company policy, he said. Like he was doing me a favor by giving me a heads up 3 days in the hospital apparently exceeded their compassion limit. The rent is due on the 1st, my father said, and it was currently the 3rd. I'd been unconscious on the 1st, fighting for my life on the 2nd, and here on the 3rd, he wanted his money. $800 for a bedroom in the house my mother had half paid for before she died. A house that mysteriously became solely his after her death, despite what I remembered about their joint ownership. When I told him I couldn't pay him from a hospital bed, when I mentioned that maybe, just maybe, his daughter's health was more important than his rental income, that's when he snapped. The slap echoed in the small room. I fell sideways off the bed, my IV ripping out, blood mixing with the existing blood in my mouth. The monitors went crazy, beeping and screaming, but no one came. Barbara did her nervous laugh. Jake finally looked up from his phone, smirked, and went back to scrolling. Tiffany popped another bubble. "You've got 3 days," my father said. "Pay up or get out." Mrs. Chen from next door chose that moment to peek into the room. She'd brought flowers, bless her heart. Yellow roses because she remembered they were my mother's favorites. She saw me on the floor, saw the blood, saw my father's stance, and her face went pale. But when she tried to help me up, my father stepped between us. "This is family business," he told her. She left the flowers on the side table and hurried away, but not before giving me a look that said she understood exactly what kind of family business this was. 3 days later, I was discharged with a bottle of painkillers and instructions to take it easy. My father had graciously allowed Jake to pick me up, which meant I had to listen to him complain about gas money for the entire 15-minute drive. He actually held out his hand for $10 when he dropped me off. I gave him $5, only because I knew I'd need the other $5 for the bus to physical therapy the next day. The house felt different when I walked in, quieter, colder. Tiffany had moved in completely while I was gone, her stuff everywhere. Her yoga mat in the living room, her protein shakes in my section of the fridge, her flat iron on my bathroom counter. She'd actually put a sign on the bathroom door that said Tiffany's Glam Room with a little heart over the eye. Barbara was at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers. Credit card applications, I realized later. She quickly covered them with a magazine when she saw me, but not before I caught a glimpse of my social security number on one of them. She gave me that chihuahua laugh and asked how I was feeling, like I'd been hit by a truck and then by my father, I wanted to say, but I just shrugged and headed to my room. That's when I found the padlock. Not on my door, but on my closet. All my work clothes, my computer, my important documents locked away. A sticky note on the lock said, "See Donald for key rent first." I sat on my bed, which now had Tiffany's leopard print throw pillows on it for some reason, and tried to think. My phone had been buzzing nonstop, work emails piling up, my boss getting increasingly irritated, clients wondering where their projects were. I needed my computer to work from home, but my computer was locked in my closet in my room that I paid rent for in a house my mother had half-owned. The next morning, I left for physical therapy at 7. When I came back at 9, the locks had been changed. My key simply didn't work. I stood there, still in pain, still barely able to turn my head without wincing, jiggling a useless key in a lock that no longer recognized me. Tiffany opened the door eventually, wearing one of my robes, the silk one my grandmother had given me for my college graduation. "Oh," she said, popping that eternal gum, "Donald said you don't live here anymore." She actually tried to close the door in my face, but I wedged my foot in, even though it sent shooting pains up my injured side. That's when I saw them all in the living room. My father, Barbara, Jake, and my father's golf buddy, Randy, who was apparently there to assess the room for its rental potential. They were discussing how much they could charge a real tenant, someone who would appreciate the opportunity. $800 was too cheap, Randy was saying. For a room that size with a private bathroom, you could get $1,200 easy. I stood in the doorway, still in my physical therapy clothes, still smelling like hospital and heartbreak, and watched my family plan my replacement. Jake was the one who noticed me first. He actually laughed, like it was funny. Like his sister being homeless with fresh stitches and broken ribs was the height of comedy. Barbara jumped up and started her nervous routine, but my father just looked at me with this cold satisfaction. "You had 3 days," he said. "It's been 3 days." I tried to explain that my belongings were inside, that I needed my work computer, my clothes, my documents. He said I could have them when I paid the back rent plus a security deposit for the new rental agreement. He'd drawn up $1,200 a month now, thanks to Randy's assessment. Mrs. Chen was watering her garden, pretending not to watch. When my father went inside to get the new rental agreement, she hurried over. She pressed something into my hand, $300 cash and a key to her garden shed. "You can stay there tonight," she whispered. But then my father came back out, and she had to pretend she was just asking about my recovery. He threatened her then, right there in broad daylight. Told her that if she interfered, he'd report her son's food truck to the health department. Make up violations. Mrs. Chen's son's food truck was her pride and joy, the culmination of their American dream. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and went back to her garden. I signed the new rental agreement with shaking hands, not because I intended to pay it, but because I needed my things. My father said I could come back tomorrow with the money and get my belongings. All of them, he promised, though Jake was already wearing my college sweatshirt and Barbara had my laptop bag over her shoulder. That night, in Mrs. Chen's garden shed, surrounded by potting soil and fertilizer, I made a decision. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. So I started making calls to the bank, to credit agencies, to old family friends who might remember things about my mother's death that I was too young to understand at the time. The first credit card company I called informed me that I had an outstanding balance of $5,000 on a card I'd never opened. The second said $3,000. The third said $7,000. All opened in the last 6 months, all with my social security number, all with bills going to my father's address but hidden from me. Barbara, sweet, nervous, Chihuahua-laughing Barbara, had stolen $15,000 worth of my financial future while serving me breakfast every morning. A week later, I was officially homeless but not hopeless. My friend Shannon had let me crash on her couch, even though her apartment was roughly the size of my father's walk-in closet. She worked nights as a nurse, so we barely saw each other. Ships passing in the night, leaving each other notes on the coffee maker. I'd managed to get back into the house once while everyone was out. Tiffany had posted on Instagram that they were all going to some casino for the day, complete with a selfie of her and my father at the slot machines. She was wearing my mother's pearl necklace, the one that had supposedly gone missing after the funeral. The window to my old room was loose, had been since I was 16 and snuck out to go to a school dance my father had forbidden me from attending. I popped it open with a butter knife and climbed in, ribs screaming in protest. My room looked like a tornado had hit it. They'd gone through everything, taken what they wanted, left the rest scattered like trash. My work computer was gone, but they'd left the old laptop I kept hidden under the floorboard, the one with the cracked screen I'd been using for my side project. Small miracles, but it was what I found in my father's office that changed everything. He'd gotten sloppy, or maybe he just never thought I'd have the nerve to look. The safe was behind the same terrible painting of a lighthouse he'd had for 20 years. The combination was still my mother's birthday because even in his cruelty, my father was predictable. Inside, I found the documentation of my father's greatest betrayal, my mother's life insurance policy. $1.5 million paid out when she died of a sudden heart attack at 39. I was 14. Jake was 11. The policy clearly stated that the money was to be held in trust for her children, accessible when we turned 18 for education and living expenses. I'd gotten nothing at 18. Jake had gotten nothing at 18. We'd both taken out student loans while my father had mysteriously afforded a new truck, a boat, yearly trips to Vegas, and apparently a secret bank account in the Cayman Islands. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the letter from my mother's doctor, dated a week before she died, warning her about dangerous interactions between her heart medication and a supplement that could cause fatal arrhythmias. The supplement bottle was in the safe, too, prescribed by a doctor I'd never heard of, filled by a pharmacy 2 towns over. The prescribing date was 2 days after the warning letter. My hands were shaking as I took photos of everything. The life insurance documents, the bank statements showing regular transfers to offshore accounts, the Medicare fraud where he was still claiming my mother as a dependent, the tax documents where he'd claimed Jake and me as dependents, even after we'd moved out and filed our own taxes. Then I heard the front door. They were back early. Tiffany was whining about losing $50. My father was in a mood. Barbara was doing her anxious laugh. And Jake was on the phone with someone about borrowing money. I put everything back except for one thing, a USB drive labeled Backup 2019. I slipped it into my pocket and carefully closed the safe. The painting went back on the wall just as I heard footsteps on the stairs. The window wouldn't close properly from the inside, so I had to leave it. I grabbed my old laptop and the few pieces of clothing they'd left behind and made it out the back door just as my father entered his office. The USB drive was a gold mine. Tax evasion going back 15 years. Fraudulent disability claims with video evidence of him playing golf, lifting weights, and helping Randy move a piano. Screenshots of emails discussing hiding assets from the IRS. And most importantly, correspondence with a lawyer about how to access trust funds meant for children if you had power of attorney. That evening, while Shannon was at work, I sat at her tiny kitchen table and started making a plan. But first, I needed to call someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my mother's sister, Aunt Catherine, the one my father had banned from our lives after the funeral. She answered on the second ring, and when she heard my voice, she started crying. "I've been waiting for this call for 15 years, she said. 2 weeks had passed since my eviction, and the bruises were finally fading from purple to green, which I considered an improvement. Shannon said I looked like a walking Monet painting, all impressionistic swirls of color. We developed a routine. She'd leave me coffee and a motivational sticky note. I'd leave her dinner and a recap of whatever drama I'd uncovered that day. Before I continue with what happened next, I need to take a moment to thank you all for listening. Your support, your comments, they keep me going. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It really helps more than you know. Aunt Catherine had driven down from Boston with boxes of documents she'd been keeping in her attic. Photos, letters, legal papers, all the things my father thought he'd destroyed. We met at a diner 2 towns over, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that could strip paint. She looked older, grayer, but her eyes were the same sharp blue as my mother's. She pushed a box across the table and told me something that made my blood run cold. My mother had been planning to divorce my father. She'd hired a lawyer, found evidence of his first affair, documented his gambling problem. The heart attack happened 2 weeks before the first court date. The lawyer my mother had hired was still practicing. Richard Hoffman, senior partner at Hoffman and Associates, with an office that smelled like old leather and justice. He remembered my mother, remembered the case, remembered being suspicious when she died but having no proof. He looked at my evidence, the USB drive contents, the photos from the safe, the credit fraud documentation. Then he leaned back in his chair and said the words I'd been hoping to hear. "We can bury him." But I needed more. My father had made one crucial mistake. He'd kept me on his car insurance to get a multi-car discount, which meant I had legal access to the policy information, including the tracking data from the safe driver discount device he'd installed, the device that showed him driving to and from work every day during the 5 years he'd been collecting disability for being unable to leave his bed. Barbara, meanwhile, was getting bolder. She'd opened 3 more cards in my name, apparently thinking I wouldn't notice while dealing with homelessness and injury. She was using them to fund her new side business, selling essential oils to other desperate housewives. She'd even tried to list me as part of her downline, earning commission off sales I'd never make. Jake had posted my grandmother's jewelry for sale online, the pearl necklace, the wedding ring set, the Art Deco brooch that had been in our family for 4 generations. He was asking for quick cash sales, clearly desperate. His crypto investment hadn't just failed, I learned. He'd borrowed from the kind of people who break fingers when you're late with payments. My boss had officially fired me via email, citing job abandonment. But my coworker, Melissa, secretly told me that my father had called the office, told them I was in rehab for drug addiction, that I'd stolen from the family to support my habit. He'd even sent them a photo of me on the hospital floor after he'd hit me, claiming it was from a drug-related incident. The investigation was exhausting. Every day brought new discoveries, new betrayals. My father had remortgaged the house my mother had half paid for, using a forged signature. He'd cashed out her retirement accounts. Using power of attorney he'd granted himself after her death. He'd sold her car to Randy for $1, then Randy had sold it back to him for $1. Some tax evasion scheme they'd cooked up. But the best discovery came from the most unexpected source, Tiffany. She'd called me one night, drunk and crying. She'd found out my father had another girlfriend, someone even younger, barely 18. She wanted revenge and thought I'd help her. I met her at a bar, bought her drinks, and listened to her ramble. Turns out Tiffany was smarter than she looked. She'd been documenting everything, thinking she'd use it for blackmail eventually. Videos of my father counting cash from his under-the-table construction work, photos of him with his disability lawyer, coaching him on how to act more injured, screenshots of his dating profiles where he claimed to be a successful businessman with no kids. She gave me everything for the price of 3 Cosmopolitans and a promise that when he went down, she'd get to watch. The IRS has a whistleblower program. If you report tax fraud and they collect, you get a percentage. The documentation I had went back 15 years. My father owed approximately $400,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest. The police were interested in the identity theft. $15,000 across 6 credit cards was felony territory. Barbara's nervous laughs wouldn't help her in court. The Social Security Administration wanted to know about the disability fraud, 5 years of payments he wasn't entitled to, plus penalties, plus potential jail time. But it was the discovery about my mother's life insurance that would be the killing blow. Trust fund fraud, insurance fraud, possibly something worse if anyone wanted to investigate her death more closely. Richard Hoffman started filing papers. Quiet at first, building the case. My father didn't know what was coming. He was too busy turning my old room into an Airbnb, posting photos online with descriptions about the charming space in a family home. Family home. The irony was almost funny. Mrs. Chen would text me updates. Your father bought a new truck, she'd write. Barbara got hair extensions. Jake was beat up yesterday, broken nose. Tiffany moved out. New girl moved in. They were spending money they didn't have, living a life built on lies and theft. But the foundation was about to crumble. My side project, the one I'd been building quietly for 3 years, was about to launch. An online consulting firm specializing in helping small businesses recover from fraud. Ironic, maybe. But I'd learned from the best thief I knew. I'd pre-sold enough contracts to cover my living expenses for a year. I'd lined up clients, built the website, created the systems, all while my father thought I was just his pathetic daughter, bleeding out on a hospital floor, begging for mercy. He had no idea what was coming. None of them did. The evidence was compiled. The agencies were notified. The lawyers were ready. The trap was set. All I had to do now was spring it. 1 month after that hospital slap, I was sitting in a real office for the first time in weeks. Not my old cubicle where my father had destroyed my reputation, but my own office. Well, technically, it was a shared workspace I'd rented for a day to meet my first official client, but it felt like the White House to me. My business, Phoenix Financial Recovery, had officially launched. The irony of the name wasn't lost on me, rising from the ashes of my father's destruction. My first client was actually Mrs. Chen's nephew, whose restaurant partner had embezzled $40,000. Within 3 hours, I'd traced the money through 6 shell companies to a casino account. He paid my $5,000 fee on the spot. But while I was building my future, I was also systematically dismantling my father's past. The IRS works slowly until they don't. The first sign something was happening was when my father's bank account got frozen. Mrs. Chen sent me a text with 17 exclamation points. Your father just had his card declined at Costco. The second sign was when a certified letter arrived at the house. Jake signed for it, thinking it was something he'd ordered online. When my father opened it and saw the audit notice, Mrs. Chen said he turned a color she'd never seen on human skin before, somewhere between purple and gray, like a bruised storm cloud. The audit covered 5 years initially, but they had the right to go back further if they found fraud, which they would because I'd made sure of it. Every cash job he'd done while on disability, documented. Every dollar he'd hidden, exposed. Every lie on every tax form, highlighted in yellow with helpful sticky notes explaining the discrepancies. Barbara's situation exploded on a Tuesday. The police showed up while she was hosting her essential oils party. 12 suburban moms watched as she was arrested for identity theft and credit fraud. She did her nervous laugh the whole time, even as they read her rights. The arresting officer later told me it was the most disturbing arrest he'd ever made, and he'd once arrested a guy dressed as a clown. The credit card companies moved fast after that. Turns out they really don't like fraud, especially when it's this well-documented. They froze all the cards, demanded immediate repayment, and started investigating whether my father knew about it. He did, of course. I had emails proving it, but I was saving those for phase 2. Jake's problem solved itself in the most karma-appropriate way possible. The people he owed money to showed up at the house the same day the IRS froze the accounts my father couldn't pay them off, and Jake couldn't hide behind Daddy anymore. He ended up having to sell everything he owned, including my grandmother's jewelry he'd stolen. But here's the beautiful part. I'd already contacted the pawn shop owner, explained the situation, and arranged to buy them back for half of what Jake got. The owner was a nice Korean man who remembered my mother and hated thieves. My father tried to salvage things by renting out my room on Airbnb, but I reported the listing for health and safety violations. which weren't hard to find. Considering the window I'd broken to get in was still broken, the smoke detectors didn't work, and there was mold in the bathroom that had been painted over rather than treated. The city inspector was very thorough, especially after I mentioned my father had bragged about never pulling permits for his DIY renovations. Tiffany's evidence was pure gold. She'd recorded my father coaching his new girlfriend, Ashley, on how to apply for credit cards in her mother's name. She had video of him literally practicing his disabled walk before a doctor's appointment, then forgetting and walking normally to his truck. She had screenshots of him selling prescription pills he got for his fake back pain. But my favorite piece of evidence was something I found by accident. My father had been claiming Jake as a dependent for tax purposes for the past 8 years, even though Jake had moved out at 21 and had been filing his own taxes. That's tax fraud for both of them, and Jake didn't even know it. When he found out, he turned on my father so fast it gave me whiplash. Richard Hoffman filed the trust fund lawsuit on a Wednesday. My father was served at his golf club in front of all his buddies. The lawsuit sought full repayment of the $1.5 million life insurance policy, plus interest plus damages. It also formally accused him of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conversion of trust assets. Randy, his golf buddy who'd helped him evade taxes, got his own surprise when the IRS showed up at his used car dealership. Turns out, when you help someone commit tax fraud, you become part of the conspiracy. His wife was particularly upset when she learned about the cash he'd been hiding from their divorce proceedings. The disability investigation moved faster than expected. They had video evidence from the Safe Driver app, from Tiffany's recordings, from social media posts where my father forgot he was supposed to be bedridden. They calculated he owed them $230,000 in fraudulent payments, plus penalties. My online business was thriving. Word spread quickly in the small business community about the woman who could track down hidden money and expose fraud. I was booked solid for 3 months out, raising my rates twice and still having to turn clients away. The best part? I was documenting everything on a blog, anonymously, of course. How to Survive Family Financial Fraud became my most popular post, shared thousands of times. The ad revenue alone was paying my rent at the new apartment I just signed a lease for, a beautiful 2-bedroom with a balcony where Mrs. Chen could visit for tea without fear of my father's threats. The house of cards was falling, and my father was scrambling to prop it up. He tried calling me, leaving voicemails that ranged from threatening to pleading to sobbing. I saved everyone. Evidence for the restraining order I'd eventually need. He tried to liquidate assets, but everything was frozen. He tried to borrow money, but his credit was destroyed. He tried to get his new girlfriend to help, but she'd Googled him and found my blog. She left him via text message while he was meeting with a bankruptcy lawyer. The trap wasn't just closing, it was slamming shut with the force of 15 years of karma coming due. 6 weeks from that hospital slap, the universe decided to collect its debt all at once. It started on a Monday morning at 9 a.m. when the IRS showed up with a seizure notice. Mrs. Chen had a front row seat and gave me a play-by-play over FaceTime. They took my father's new truck first, the one he'd bought with my mother's trust fund money. He actually tried to claim it was a medical necessity for his fake disability, but the agent just laughed and pointed to the lifted suspension and racing stripes. Pretty sure those aren't standard medical modifications. They tagged everything in the house for auction. The boat, the jet skis, the home theater system, even Barbara's essential oils inventory. She wasn't there. She was in county jail, unable to make bail because their accounts were frozen. Her lawyer had already contacted me about a plea deal. I told him I'd think about it, but we both knew I wouldn't budge. The trust fund lawsuit had triggered an investigation into my mother's death. I hadn't pushed for it, but once the authorities saw the life insurance documents and the suspicious timing, they opened a cold case review. My father panicked and tried to destroy evidence, but Tiffany had already given the police the safe combination. They found everything, including documents I hadn't even known existed. Jake cracked like an egg. Faced with his own tax fraud charges, he agreed to testify against our father. He admitted to knowing about the trust fund, about helping hide assets, about the fake disability claims. He even revealed something I didn't know. My father had a second family in Florida, a woman he'd been sending money to for 10 years, with 2 kids he claimed on taxes in that state too. The Florida revelation brought in the FBI for interstate fraud. My father went from facing state charges to federal ones. The prosecutor called me personally to say it was one of the most extensive family fraud cases she'd ever seen. But the real circus started when the story went viral. A local reporter had been following the case after the very public arrest at the golf club. She'd interviewed Mrs. Chen, some of my former coworkers who knew the truth, and even Tiffany, who showed up to the interview in full glam wearing my mother's pearl necklace, which I'd bought back and given to her as a thank you gift. The headline read, "Local Man Defrauds Dead Wife's Trust, Leaves Daughter Homeless After Accident." It got picked up by national news. My blog traffic exploded. I had to upgrade my hosting twice in one day. My father tried to do damage control. He went on local radio claiming I was a disgruntled daughter making things up for attention. But the host had done his homework. He played audio of my father from his disability hearing, claiming he couldn't walk, then played video from that same day of him carrying a refrigerator upstairs for his under-the-table moving business. The interview ended with my father screaming profanities and threatening to sue everyone. The station had to bleep so much of it that it sounded like Morse code. It became a meme. Someone even made a remix that hit 1 million views on TikTok. The IRS auction was scheduled for a Saturday. I showed up with cash, prepared to buy back anything of my mother's they were selling. But here's where the story gets beautiful. The auctioneer recognized me from the news he'd lost his own mother young and understood what this meant. He made sure every single item of sentimental value went to me for the minimum bid. My mother's china set, $1. Her wedding album, $1. The rocking chair she'd nursed us in, $1. Other bidders started catching on and stepping back, letting me reclaim my heritage $1 at a time. An older woman in the back was crying. She hugged me afterward and said my mother would be proud. My father watched from his car, unable to enter because of the restraining order I'd gotten after he'd shown up drunk at Shannon's apartment. He had to witness his entire life being sold off, his house being emptied, his world crumbling, and he couldn't do anything but watch. The criminal trial was set for 3 months out, but the financial destruction was immediate. The IRS wanted $600,000 including penalties. Social Security wanted $230,000. The trust fund lawsuit judgment came back at $2.1 million with interest. His total debt was over $3 million. He declared bankruptcy. But you can't discharge fraud judgments. He'd be paying this back for the rest of his life if he wasn't in prison. The prosecutor was pushing for 15 years. Barbara took a plea deal, 18 months, and full restitution. She gave up everything, including recordings of my father planning the fraud. Turns out she'd been recording him too, insurance for when he inevitably turned on her. Criminals really don't trust each other, do they? Jake got probation and community service, plus he had to pay back everything he'd stolen from me. The judge garnished his wages for the next 10 years. He got a job at the car wash my father used to mock, the exact one where he'd said only losers work. He had to wear the uniform with the little hat and everything. The second family in Florida sued my father for fraud and emotional distress. The woman had been told he was a widower with no children, that he was wealthy from his construction business. She'd been living off his payments, not knowing it was stolen money. She was actually a nice lady, a teacher who'd been conned just like the rest of us. We talk sometimes now, bonded by our mutual desire to see him rot. But the sweetest moment came when my business hit its first million in revenue. 6 weeks from homeless to millionaire. At least on paper, I celebrated by taking Mrs. Chen to the nicest restaurant in town, the one my father had always claimed was too expensive for us, but where he'd taken his girlfriends. We sat at the best table, ordered champagne, and toasted to karma. The waiter recognized me from the news and comped our dessert. The chef came out to shake my hand. The whole restaurant knew my story, and they were all Team Quiana. 2 months after that hospital slap, my father stood in a courtroom in an orange jumpsuit that clashed horribly with his complexion. He'd aged 10 years in 8 weeks, his hair gone gray at the roots where Barbara wasn't around to dye it for him. The federal charges had stuck. wire fraud, mail fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The state added elder abuse charges when they found out he'd been stealing from my grandmother before she died. She'd had dementia, and he'd convinced her to sign over her Social Security checks. His lawyer tried to paint him as a grieving widower who'd made mistakes, but the prosecutor had receipts, literal receipts, from Vegas trips, from his boat purchase the day after my mother's funeral, from the breast augmentation he'd bought for girlfriend number 3 while I was taking out student loans. The judge wasn't sympathetic. She'd seen the hospital security footage of him slapping me. She'd read the emails where he laughed about leaving me homeless. She'd reviewed the trust fund documents showing he'd stolen from his own children while we struggled. 15 years. That was the sentence. 15 years in federal prison, no possibility of early release for 5. He'd be 72 when he got out. If he lived that long, he'd miss everything. Any grandchildren I might have, any chance to redeem himself, any possibility of a normal life. But before they took him away, the judge allowed victim impact statements. I'd prepared mine for weeks, practicing in front of the mirror until I could say it without crying. I told the court about growing up without a mother, about working 3 jobs in college while he spent my trust fund on gambling. I told them about the nights I'd gone hungry so I could pay the rent he demanded. I told them about the hospital, the slap, the blood in my mouth, the fear that he might actually kill me one day. But I also told them about my success, about my business that now employed 12 people, about the foundation I was starting for young women who'd been financially abused by family members, about the book deal I'd just signed to tell this story to the world. I looked him in the eye and said, "You tried to bury me, not knowing I was a seed. Now watch me grow." The courtroom erupted in applause, which the judge allowed for exactly 3 seconds before calling for order. My father tried to respond, but his own lawyer put a hand on his shoulder and shook his head. There was nothing left to say. Barbara was already serving her time, teaching yoga to other inmates and writing me letters apologizing, asking for forgiveness. I sent them back unopened. Some bridges are meant to stay burned. Jake had a different journey. The garnishment of his wages had forced him to actually work for the first time in his life. The humiliation of the car wash had humbled him. He'd started attending Gamblers, Anonymous, got a second job, and was slowly paying back what he owed. He'd written me a letter, a real one, not asking for anything. He'd admitted he'd been jealous of me our whole lives, that Dad had pitted us against each other, that he'd chosen the easy path of being the golden child while I'd fought for everything. He said he was sorry about Mom, about the jewelry, about not standing up for me at the hospital. I wrote back, just once. I told him forgiveness was earned, not given, but that I was watching his progress. Maybe someday we could be siblings again. Maybe. The house was foreclosed on. My father had leveraged it to the hilt, and without his illegal income, the payments couldn't be made. It went to auction, and you'll never guess who bought it. Mrs. Chen's son, the one with the food truck my father had threatened. He'd saved for years and got it for half its value. He turned it into a community center for elderly Asian immigrants, a place for them to gather, take English classes, get help with paperwork. He put a plaque by the front door. In memory of Linda Graves, it said, a mother taken too soon. My mother would have loved that. She'd always been kind to Mrs. Chen, always helped with translations and rides to appointments. The investigation into my mother's death remained open but inconclusive. The supplement that could have caused her heart attack had been legally prescribed, even if suspiciously timed. Without concrete proof of intent, they couldn't charge him with murder. But everyone knew. The whole town knew what he'd probably done. His reputation was destroyed beyond repair. His golf club revoked his membership. His favorite bar banned him for life. Even the grocery store employees would mysteriously run out of whatever he tried to buy. He was a pariah before he even got to prison. I used part of the recovered trust fund money to hire a forensic accountant to find everything else he'd hidden. We discovered accounts in the Bahamas, cryptocurrency wallets, even gold coins buried in the backyard like some paranoid pirate. Every penny was seized and put toward his debts. The book advance was substantial, enough to buy my own house outright. I chose a beautiful Victorian 3 blocks from Mrs. Chen, with a garden where I could grow the yellow roses my mother had loved. The first night in my own home, I sat on the porch swing and cried. Good tears, finally, tears of relief, of freedom, of victory. My business had grown beyond my dreams. We'd helped recover over $50 million in the first year, taking a percentage that made me wealthy beyond anything I'd imagined. I hired Shannon as my operations manager. Gave her a salary that let her quit nursing and work normal hours. I hired other women who'd been financially abused, trained them, gave them careers and hope. 6 months after that hospital slap, I stood at my mother's grave with news she would have loved. The yellow roses I'd brought seemed to glow in the morning sun, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt her presence as comfort rather than sorrow. Dad got 15 years, I told the headstone. Barbara's in jail, Jake's actually working, and I'm okay, Mom. I'm more than okay, I'm thriving. The foundation I'd started, the Linda Graves Fund for Financial Freedom, had just given its first grants. 10 women, all under 30, all escaping financial abuse from family members. We provided emergency housing, legal assistance, and financial counseling. One recipient had already started her own business with our help, a bakery that donated day-old bread to shelters. My father had been in prison for 2 months when I got the call. He'd been beaten by other inmates after they found out he'd stolen from his dead wife's children. He was in the infirmary, would recover, but would need protective custody for the rest of his sentence. Alone, isolated, afraid every day. I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt nothing, which was its own kind of freedom. Jake had surprised everyone by actually sticking to his redemption. He'd paid back half of what he owed already, working 80-hour weeks between the car wash and a night janitor job. He'd even started dating a nice girl from his GA meetings, someone who understood struggle and growth. He'd sent me a photo of them at a free concert in the park, both smiling genuinely. I'd smiled back, alone in my office, and saved the photo. Barbara had found religion in prison because of course she had. She'd become the chaplain's assistant, leading prayer groups with the same nervous energy she'd once brought to essential oil parties. Her letters had stopped coming after I had my lawyer send a cease and desist. The silence was golden. The media attention had finally died down, though I still got recognized sometimes, usually by women who'd pull me aside in grocery stores or coffee shops to whisper their own stories of family financial abuse. I'd give them my card, tell them they weren't alone, that there was hope beyond the pain. My business had expanded to 3 cities, with plans for national coverage by year's end. We'd been featured in Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, and even 60 Minutes' Anderson Cooper had called my story a testament to resilience. My father had probably watched that interview from his cell, though the thought gave me no satisfaction. The best revenge was living well, and I was living exceptionally. Mrs. Chen had become my unofficial grandmother, joining me for Sunday dinners and teaching me to make her famous dumplings. Her son had turned my childhood home into a beautiful community space, and sometimes I'd stop by to teach financial literacy classes in the room that used to be mine. The irony wasn't lost on me, teaching economic empowerment in the space where I'd been economically enslaved. The surprise came when Ashley, my father's last girlfriend, reached out. She was 18, traumatized, and pregnant. My father had convinced her to drop out of high school, isolated her from her family, and abandoned her when his world collapsed. She had nowhere to go. I could have turned her away. No one would have blamed me. But I saw myself in her eyes, another girl my father had tried to destroy. I connected her with the foundation, got her into transitional housing, helped her get her GED. When her daughter was born, she named her Linda, after my mother. I cried when she told me, the kind of tears that heal old wounds. The ultimate plot twist came when the IRS whistleblower payment came through. 30% of what they collected from my father's tax fraud, just over $200,000, deposited directly into my account on a random Tuesday. I stared at the balance for an hour, calculating how many women the foundation could help with that money. But first, I did something for myself. I flew to Paris, first class, and stayed for 2 weeks. I'd always dreamed of seeing the Eiffel Tower, eating real croissants, walking along the Seine. My mother had promised to take me for my 16th birthday, a promise my father had broken along with everything else. I sent him a postcard from the top of the tower. The message was simple: wish you were here. Just kidding. Q. When I returned, there was a letter waiting from Aunt Catherine. She'd been diagnosed with cancer, stage 3, and wanted to see me. I drove to Boston that night, held her hand through chemo treatments, moved into her guest room to help with her care. She'd been there for me when I'd needed truth. Now I'd be there for her through whatever came next. She recovered, against all odds. We celebrated with champagne and plans for her to move closer to me. She'd sell her Boston house, buy something near mine and Mrs. Chen's. We'd form our own little family, chosen and cherished, bound by love rather than blood. The final cosmic justice came in month 6, my father's prison job assignment. Financial clerk in the library, helping other inmates with their taxes. He made 14 cents an hour, which was garnished for restitution. At that rate, he'd need to live to be 400 to pay everything back. His new girlfriend turned out to be an IRS auditor who'd been investigating him separately. She'd played him like a fiddle, gathering evidence while pretending to fall for his charms. She sent me a thank you card with a Starbucks gift card inside. Just wanted you to know he never had a chance, she'd written. Professional admiration from one fraud hunter to another. Standing in my garden now, 6 months after everything started, I watched the sunset over my yellow roses. My phone buzzed with messages from clients, employees, friends who'd become family. The foundation had just been approved for a major grant. My book was already in its 3rd printing. Life was good in ways I'd never imagined possible.